"You built an unsafe structure," she said, tapping her clipboard against my new patio railing, "and the county inspector is going to prove it." 3 days later, that same inspector stood in my backyard, looked her dead in the eye, and said something that made her face go white. But before I tell you what he said, you need to understand exactly how we got there. My name is Marcus, and until 11 weeks ago, I lived what I'd call a boringly happy life in Cedar Hollow Estates, a quiet subdivision of 42 homes just outside Raleigh. Brick facades, mature oak trees, a community pool nobody used past July. I'd bought my house 4 years earlier, a modest 3-bedroom with a cracked, sinking concrete slab out back that had been an eyesore since the day I got the keys. Every spring I told myself I'd fix it. Every spring, life got in the way. This year, I finally did it. I saved for 18 months, hired a licensed contractor named Ray who'd built patios in this county for over 20 years, and pulled every permit the city required before a single stone was laid. Flagstone paving, a low fieldstone retaining wall, a cedar pergola with string lights built to code, inspected and approved by the city at the framing stage. It was the kind of backyard upgrade you see in magazines. I was proud of it. My neighbors on either side loved it. Kids from down the block started asking if they could see the cool patio. Then there was Diane Whitfield. Diane had been president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association for 6 years, and in that time she'd developed a reputation. Not for community events or thoughtful leadership, for citations. She defined a woman 2 doors down $80 for a garden gnome she deemed not in keeping with community aesthetic. She sent a certified letter to a retired veteran about a flagpole that was, by her measurement, 4 inches too tall. People didn't cross Diane, people avoided her. I hadn't thought twice about her. My permits were filed, my contractor was licensed, my paperwork was clean. I genuinely believed that was the end of it. I should mention, too, that Cedar Hollow wasn't some rundown neighborhood desperate for rules. It was the kind of place realtors used in their listing photos, trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, a 4th of July block party every single year. People moved here precisely because they wanted order. What they didn't sign up for was one woman deciding, unilaterally, what order meant on any given week. And for 6 years, nobody had found a reason or found the nerve to test her on it. I was wrong to think I'd be the exception. It started on a Tuesday morning in April, 9 days after Ray's crew finished the final course of Flagstone. I was drinking coffee on my new patio, genuinely just sitting there, admiring the pergola shadows on the stone, when I heard the unmistakable click of heels on my driveway. Diane in a blazer, clipboard in hand, camera phone already raised. "Marcus," she said, not a greeting, just my name, like she was confirming a suspect. "This structure was never approved by the Architectural Review Committee." I told her calmly that it didn't need Architectural Review Committee approval for permitted structural work under city code, and that I had the permits inside if she wanted to see them. "The permits are irrelevant," she said. "This is an HOA matter, I'm filing a complaint." "Filing it over what exactly?" I asked, still holding my coffee, still not entirely convinced this was serious. "Over safety," she said, snapping a photo of the retaining wall from an angle that made it look taller than it was. "And over process. You don't get to just build whatever you want because a city clerk stamped a form." I remember thinking at the time that this was almost funny. A city clerk hadn't stamped anything, a licensed structural review had. I didn't say that out loud. I wish, looking back, that I had. 3 days later, I received an email. Not a letter, an email sent at 11:47 p.m. Subject line, "Urgent, unauthorized structural modification violation notice 1147. It cited unsafe construction practices, unauthorized retaining wall height, and bizarrely, excessive lighting disrupting neighborhood character. I read it twice, laughed once, and figured it would blow over once she saw the permits. It didn't blow over. 4 days later, a second notice arrived, this one a printed letter taped to my front door. It referenced a mandatory compliance hearing in 14 days and threatened a $200 per week fine if the structure wasn't brought into compliance or removed. I stood on my porch, letter in hand, and felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a campaign. I called Ray that night. He'd built patios like mine for 2 decades and had never once heard of an HOA disputing a structure that passed city inspection. "Marcus," he said, "get every document. Permits, inspection sign-offs, everything. Something's off here." I didn't know yet how off it really was or how far Diane was willing to take this. The following Monday, I found a neighbor, Priya, waiting at my mailbox. She lived in Cedar Hollow for 9 years and had watched Diane operate longer than anyone. "She does this," Priya said quietly, glancing back toward Diane's house like she was afraid of being overheard. "She picks someone new every spring, Finds them into exhaustion until they either cave or move. Last year it was the Chen's fence. Year before that, somebody's mailbox post. Why does nobody stop her? I asked. Priya just shook her head. Because fighting her costs more than paying her. That night I pulled out my contractor's file, permits, framing inspection sign-off. Final inspections scheduled for the following week, a routine city closeout, nothing to do with the HOA at all. I photographed every page. I had no idea yet that this stack of paper was about to become the most important evidence of my life, or that Diane's next move would nearly cost me thousands of dollars I didn't have. The compliance hearing arrived faster than I expected, and it did not go the way I hoped. I walked into the small clubhouse meeting room with a manila folder of permits, expecting a reasonable conversation. Instead, I found 5 board members seated behind a folding table, Diane at the center like a judge presiding over her own courtroom. She opened with a slideshow. Actual photographs of my patio zoomed in on the retaining wall, red circles drawn around stones she claimed were structurally compromised. The wall height exceeds our 18-inch limit, she announced. The lighting violates dark sky provisions, and most concerning, she paused for effect, residents have expressed safety concerns about structural integrity. I asked which residents. She said that information was confidential. I placed my permit folder on the table. The city approved this at 18 inches, measured from grade, which is what the permit requires. Here's the framing inspection. Here's the final permit application, already scheduled for closeout inspection next Thursday. Diane barely glanced at it. HOA covenants supersede city permits on private property, she said. You were required to submit an architectural modification request before construction. You didn't. That alone is a violation. Here's what I didn't know at the time, Section 4. 2 of our HOA covenants, the actual governing document, not Diane's interpretation of it, explicitly stated that structural additions with a valid municipal building permit were exempt from Architectural Review Committee pre-approval. I hadn't read that section closely. I would very soon. One board member, an older man named Frank who'd barely said a word all evening, cleared his throat and asked whether anyone had actually consulted the municipal permit file before the vote. Diane answered before anyone else could. I've reviewed everything necessary, she said in a tone that closed the subject. Frank glanced at me, almost apologetic, and said nothing further. He would end up being the single no vote. The board voted 4-1 to uphold the violation. The fine, $200 per week, retroactive to the first notice, with an order to remove or substantially modify the retaining wall within 30 days. I left that meeting doing math in my head. 30 days, $200 a week. Already over $600 owed, climbing daily, for a patio the city itself hadn't finished inspecting yet. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, pulled up our HOA's governing documents, all 41 pages of them, something I'd skimmed once at closing and never looked at again. I read every section, and on page 17 under section 4.2, municipal permit exemption, I found it. Structures constructed under a valid, currently permitted municipal building permit are exempt from Architectural Review Committee pre-approval, provided permit documentation is submitted to the association within 30 days of permit issuance. I had submitted mine. I had the email confirmation timestamped the same week Ray broke ground. I had proof Diane either never checked her own governing documents or checked them and buried the exemption anyway. My hands were actually shaking as I read it a second time. This wasn't a gray area. This was a homeowners association president, knowingly or not, fining me for something her own bylaws explicitly protected. The next morning, I called the county building department to confirm my final closeout inspection was still scheduled. It was Thursday, 10 a.m. Inspector name, Gerald Ackafer, 22 years with the county, a man Ray described as the most by-the-book inspector in 3 counties. I didn't call Diane, I didn't warn her, I simply waited. Wednesday night, one more notice appeared on my door. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was a letter from a law firm, retained, apparently, by the association, threatening a lien on my property if the fines remained unpaid past 45 days. A lien, on my house, over a patio the city had approved from the very beginning. I sat on my new patio that night, under the pergola lights Diane had called a dark sky violation, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with her anymore. I was going to let the facts speak in front of witnesses on the record the very next morning. Thursday came dry and clear, perfect weather for an inspection. Gerald Ackafer arrived at 9:52, 8 minutes early, tape measure and clipboard in hand, exactly as promised. I met him at the gate and walked him back without saying a word about Diane. I wanted his eyes fresh, unbiased, uninfluenced by anything except what was actually built. He hadn't been measuring for 4 minutes when I heard the click of heels on my driveway again. Diane appeared at the side gate, uninvited, camera phone raised before she'd even said hello. "I'd like to observe this inspection," she announced. "As HOA president, I have concerns about safety." Gerald looked up, unbothered. "This is a city inspection on private property with the homeowner's permission. You're welcome to stay quiet and watch from there." He pointed to the far end of the yard, a good 15 feet back. Diane's jaw tightened, but she stayed. For the next 20 minutes, Gerald measured everything. Wall height at 4 separate points, footing depth, drainage slope, post spacing on the pergola, electrical connections for the lighting. He photographed each measurement, narrating out loud, almost like he knew this needed to be documented beyond doubt. "Wall height 18 inches at grade within code," he said. "Footings poured to 12 inches exceeds minimum requirement." He tapped the pergola post. "Structurally sound, properly anchored, no movement under load test." He crouched by the outlet box for the string lights. "GFCI protected, correctly installed up to residential code." At one point she called out, "Are you documenting the lighting as well? The dark sky violation." Gerald didn't even look up. "String lights on a GFCI-protected residential circuit aren't a municipal violation, ma'am. That's not something my department regulates." Diane went quiet for almost a full minute after that. Diane's voice cut across the yard. "What about the safety concerns raised by residents?" "The structural instability." Gerald stood up, brushed off his knees, and turned to face her directly. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 22 years. This is one of the cleanest residential patio installations I've inspected all year. There is no structural instability. There is no safety violation. Whoever told you otherwise either hasn't seen the work or isn't being honest with you." The silence that followed felt like it lasted a full minute. "I'll need that in writing," I said, keeping my voice level even though my heart was pounding. "You'll have the official report by end of day," Gerald said. "For the record, this passes final inspection. Approved, no corrections needed." Diane's face had gone pale, the flush of confidence drained right out of it. She didn't argue with Gerald. Nobody argues with the man holding the clipboard that actually matters. She turned, walked back through the gate without another word, and I watched her get into her car and sit there for almost 2 full minutes before driving away. That afternoon, I emailed the HOA board directly. Attached, the county's official final inspection report, marked approved, no violations, alongside Section 4, 2 of our own governing documents and my original permit submission timestamp. Subject line, compliance confirmation and request for immediate fine reversal. 2 board members responded within the hour, both apologetic, both clearly uncomfortable. One admitted privately she'd never actually seen photos of the finished patio before voting to fine me. She'd only seen Diane's zoomed-in, cherry-picked images at the hearing. A special board session was called 4 days later. I wasn't required to attend, but I did, folder in hand, county report on top. This time I didn't have to say much. The board president pro tem read the inspection report aloud to the room. "Read Section 4.2 aloud." Asked Diane directly in front of the other 4 members why a documented permit exemption submitted on time had been ignored during the original hearing. Diane's answer was that she'd been acting in the best interest of community standards. Nobody in that room found that a satisfying explanation. The board voted, unanimously this time, to reverse every fine, dismiss the violation entirely, and issue a formal written apology. My $600 in climbing became $0 owed. The lien threat vanished the same week. The law firm received a copy of the county's approved report. Funny how quickly lawyers lose interest in a case with no legal ground to stand on. But the part that actually surprised me came 3 weeks later. Priya texted me a photo. A new violation notice taped to a different door on a different street. The Alvarez family 2 blocks over cited for a non-compliant shed roof pitch. Same aggressive language, same clipboard photos, same 14-day hearing deadline. Diane had already moved on quietly to her next target, as if my case had simply been a speed bump instead of a lesson. I thought about warning the Alvarez family myself. Instead, I did something better. I typed up everything, the covenant section, the timeline, the inspection report, even Gerald's exact words, and posted it in our neighborhood group chat with one simple line. "If she ever comes for your renovation, here's exactly what to do." Within a day, 3 other households had messaged me for copies of the covenant excerpt. Within a week, Diane quietly withdrew the Alvarez complaint without explanation. At the next annual HOA election, 5 months later, Diane didn't run for re-election. I heard through Priya that she'd decided to focus on other priorities. Cedar Hollow elected a new board president, a soft-spoken retired engineer named Tom, who, in his first newsletter, promised a full review of how complaints were handled going forward. including a new rule requiring any structural violation claimed to be reviewed against city permit records before a hearing could even be scheduled. Frank, the board member who'd cast that one lonely no vote, was appointed to chair the review committee. Somewhere in that irony, I found a small, satisfying kind of justice all its own. I'm not going to pretend Diane vanished from the neighborhood entirely. She still walks her dog past my house most mornings, still avoids eye contact when she does. Sometimes I wonder if she ever went back and actually read Section 4.2 in full, or if she still believes somewhere that she was simply protecting the neighborhood. I've stopped wondering too hard about it. Some people only ever learn a lesson when the paperwork forces them to. My patio still stands exactly the way Ray built it. Flagstones still cool under bare feet in the evening. Pergola lights still glowing every night, the same dark sky violation that turned out to be perfectly, boringly legal. I sit out there most evenings now, coffee in hand, and I think about how close I came to just paying the fine because it felt easier than fighting it. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone dealing with an HOA that's decided you're their next target, it's this: read the actual governing documents before you assume you're wrong. Get everything in writing. Never let anyone, board president or otherwise, convince you that their opinion outweighs a permit, an inspection, or the plain text of the rules they're supposed to follow themselves. The truth doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs a clipboard, an inspector, and 20 minutes to speak for itself. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever had a Diane of your own, you already know why stories like this matter. Drop a comment and tell me what your HOA tried to pull. I read every single one. And if you want more of these real, satisfying justice stories, you know exactly what to do next.